The book of Lamentations is written by Jeremiah and looks back on the destruction of Jerusalem. We read the entire book this week by reading one chapter each day, Monday through Friday. A devotion will be posted daily to go along with the chapter read. And if you haven't checked out my blog spot, please do so at biblicalshakers.blogspot.com. Jeremiah begins in chapter 1 with a song of sorrow for the defeat of Judah, the destroyed temple, and the people who were taken away to Babylon as captives. His tears were for the humiliation and the suffering of the people. He wept because God had rejected the people for their rebellious ways. The first 4 chapters are written in the form of Hebrew poetry, which I think makes it easier to read and follow. While chapter 1 describes Jerusalem's desolation and calls for God's revenge on his enemies, chapter 2 includes a call for God's people to pour out their hearts in the Lord's presence. But it is only when sin breaks our hearts that God can come to our rescue. This horrible scene could have been avoided. Jeremiah had warned the people for years, and it broke his heart to see it fulfilled. His darkest moments were fulfilled by the hope and assurance that he had in God. Chapter 3, the central chapter, marks the turning point in Jeremiah's experience of grief and prayer. As he looked at himself, he saw an aged man on a winding path in the dark, being pursued by lions. Then he looked away from himself and by faith looked to the Lord. That is when he said, I have hope. Because God's mercies and compassions and faithfulness are new every day, you have the right to claim them each morning. Verses 22 and 23 say this beautifully and are 2 verses to remember and perhaps to memorize. The greatest destruction from sin is not to buildings or things, but to people. In God's sight, his people had been like gold and precious gems, but now they were only cheap clay pots. Healthy young men were but walking corpses and would be better off dead, as in verses 7 through 9 in chapter 4. If you want to cheapen yourselves and others, sin will do it. A high calling mocked by low living results in deep suffering. Lamentations gives us a portrait of the bitter suffering the people of Jerusalem experienced when sin caught up with them and God turned his back on them. However, God did not abandon them. In the final chapter of Lamentations, Jeremiah prays and pleads for restoration. They could be restored if they would turn to him with their whole heart. Hope is found only in the Lord. Thus, our grief should turn us toward him and not away from him. Next week, we are going to be returning to the New Testament, and you will have to check in and see what book we will be reading from. And don't forget, Biblical Shakers makes reading the Bible way more enjoyable for you. And I pray that the Lord will put a hunger on your heart.